And it looks like most people stayed logged in during the lunch. So I wouldn't expect that there's a lot of people that need to be readmitted to the meeting, which is perfect. All right. So we're going to be continuing with talking about imaginal exposure. We're going to be doing that for about the next 40 minutes, and then we'll take a break when our patient participant will be able to come, and he's going to share his story about living with OCD, his journey to being diagnosed with OCD, and his experience in exposure and response prevention. He's going to be able to share his story for a decent amount of time, and then we'll have time for question and answer. I know that you've heard us say this many times, and for some of you, it may feel redundant, but we just feel like it's tremendously important. And also know that in a training of 300 people get up and they walk to the bathroom, or they have to get on a phone call or something like that. So we're being repetitive just so we make sure we capture as many of your ears as possible. It would be really important to treat his coming to this training with the same level of privacy that you would have for your own clients. So this is not something to share with family members or sitting in a Starbucks or anything like that. He's coming specifically for the purpose of talking to trained mental health providers about his experience, and it's very generous of him to do so. So one of the things I'm going to do is just set our agenda for the afternoon. Probably up until our break, we're going to be focusing on imaginal exposure. I have a couple of examples I'm going to show you. And then by that point, we're going to start talking about, towards the end of the afternoon, some special topics. I want to do a time reminder. Steve may have already done this yesterday, but we will be going today until 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll probably be taking our break around 3:30 Eastern Standard Time. The thing I want to prep you guys for is the schedule for tomorrow. So tomorrow is the only day of the 4-day training that you are going from 9 a.m. Eastern to 4 p.m. Eastern. The training actually ends at 4 p.m., not 5 p.m. That's the way that it's always been scheduled. You get the same amount of continuing education credits, but just so you're aware, we will take lunch break at the same time. So again, tomorrow lunch break will be from 12:40 to 1:20, and you'll get 2 10-minute breaks in the morning block and the afternoon block. But that's one of the quirky things about the schedule. I just want to make sure that you're prepared for. I know that you guys are Zoom pros at this point, so I feel like I don't have to reorient you to raising your hand and lowering your hand. I've been able to pop in and out at times where some of my colleagues are training, so I can see that you guys are really savvy with this. Again, we are going to be really focused on some particular content this afternoon, so I'm really going to ask to prioritize questions about the content that we're teaching today, and then any of those more sort of like general overview questions from other parts of the training we'll be able to get to on day 4. Steve is going to have a lot of time tomorrow to be able to wrap up any of those cliffhanger questions that you guys have. So what I'm going to do now is I want to sort of get through a couple more slides about imaginal exposure. And then I have a demonstration that I'd like to play for you. And then we're going to talk about some different variations of imaginal exposure. So just picking up where Steve left off, we had just, let me just get my slides sharing, and then I'll say what I was to say. Give me a second so that I can share this. Okay. Could you guys give me a wave that you're seeing the when not to do imaginal exposure slide? Great. Excellent. And audio is good. The sound is okay. It's not lagging in video. Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to flip back for a moment. We just covered the do's and don'ts. Okay. The do's and don'ts are something that you can refer back to. The idea is not to have this memorized. The idea is that these slides can serve as a little bit of a guidebook for your decision-making around this. So there are times when imaginal exposure should not be your primary exposure of choice. And there are a couple of concrete reasons when that might be the case. The first is that when in vivo exposure is easily done, I really want to emphasize this. Any time where confronting or facing this obsessional fear can be done in an in vivo way, you should do it in an in vivo way first. We know this both from the literature on exposure and response prevention, and even from other kinds of learning experiments and trials. In vivo exposure, where someone is actually doing something in real life, in real time, is just a more effective method of learning. And really what we're doing in any kind of exposure therapy, ERP included, is learning how to have a new relationship with things that people are afraid of, right? We're just retraining the brain. So anytime you can do an in vivo to help someone face a triggering situation for their obsessions or their obsessions themselves, you want to try to do the in vivo first. When you would do imaginal would be when in vivo cannot be easily done or cannot be safely done. So when also not to do imaginal, not working when it's not working even after modifications. What we mean by this tab is, let's say an imaginal exposure is an appropriate kind of exposure for this person's fear and this particular triggering situation. If you've done imaginal exposure a couple of times, you've made specific modifications. We're going to talk about some modifications, including writing an imaginal exposure script, which is what Steve already went over. And I'm also going to talk about unscripted imaginal exposure in a few minutes. Even after making certain modifications, if the imaginal exposure is not working, AKA, it is not resulting in some kind of habituation across many repetitions of prolonged practice, or 2, it is not disconfirming fears, or 3, it is not increasing mastery of tolerance of uncertainty, mastery over anxiety, right? Sort of just that general confidence and competence, then it's time to stop doing imaginal exposure, right? So the bottom line with this is, if imaginal exposure is not turning out to be effective, move on to something else. Another time where doing imaginal exposure might not be a good idea is when somebody has really overvalued ideation. Now, the difference between somebody having obsessions versus overvalued ideation is overvalued ideation can be sort of more the flavor or the quality of this obsessions, not the content of the obsessions. If you look back at the Y box in the version that we sent you, and this should be in any valid version, there are some supplemental questions past the 10 question severity score. There are questions about insight, and overvalued responsibility. The overvalued ideation kind of falls into the insight category. So really, overvalued ideation means that it is a tendency that some people with OCD have to really cling to their beliefs despite evidence to the contrary. And so this would be overvalued ideation about their obsessions, that they have a hard time increasing insight into the ridiculousness or excessiveness of their obsessions, even despite disconfirmation and evidence to the contrary. And so another way that this can look is someone who has pretty poor insight into the excessiveness or ridiculous of their obsessional content. In that case, when somebody is and they're just really exploring their obsessions, they may not be able to have that sort of like disconfirmation aha moment from imaginal exposure. You might need something more behavioral, something more concrete, observable, tangible, like an in vivo exposure, to help increase the possibility of disconfirmation of their fears. And then the last time is if the patient's not willing to do imaginal exposure, or they're not willing to engage, or sometimes it's not a willfulness, it's how would I want to put this? Just like an inability to engage. And so sometimes we get questions from patients of, I'm just not a visual thinker, right? Like I don't have a great imagination. I've tried guided imagery before, and I just don't have this like inner visual representation. I don't dream a lot, these kinds of things. When I hear that from a patient, that's not a rule out for me. I'm still going to try, because there's still the idea of confronting the narrative, this story that goes from start to finish, practicing the words, saying the words out loud, that can have a lot of value. But again, it's not. Imaginal exposure is partially based on imagery. right? That's why it's called imaginal exposure. It is an imagery exercise. If there's something about the way that a person's brain works where they're not great at imagery, that's just not something they're inclined to. And it feels like even just the narrative piece of this and saying certain things out loud is not very effective for them. It's not emotionally engaging. It's not getting at the reason why we're doing exposure in the first place. Then that would be another reason to move on from imaginal exposure and even potentially not come back to it for a particular patient. Okay, now we also want to teach you about this idea of using mini imaginals. And so there's not always the time for someone to sit down and read through or listen to reiterations of an imaginal exposure or imaginal exposure script for 20 to 30 minutes. Sometimes you don't have the time for that. So we can actually use little mini imaginals as sort of like an adjunct to the full imaginal exposure. So what we mean by this is it's almost like an imaginal exposure statement. You can ask the patient to create a shorthand or like a mini imaginal exposure statement. And then you can use this as a compound exposure strategy when doing in vivo exposures. So what I mean by this is when somebody is doing in vivo exposures, often, at least for the first half of treatment, while they're working their way up their hierarchy, we really want to be isolating out and facing one feared situation or one triggering situation at a time. So for example, if somebody has contamination fears about dirt germs, and they also have magical thinking about saying certain words, and if they say certain words, their mother will die. In the early stages of treatment, if one of our identified exposures is to go around touching lots and lots of doorknobs in a public place without any hand washing or avoidance or sanitizing to face the fear that they're getting contaminated by germs, in the early days, especially when that's the first time we're doing this exposure, I'm not superimposing on top of that exposure they're already doing this secondary element of, yeah, and you know what, if you're contaminated enough, maybe you'll spread the contamination and maybe your mother will die or whatever it might be. However, once we get much further along in treatment, especially once somebody maybe has done some imaginal exposures that relate to certain content, you can use these mini imaginal exposure like one-liners or two-liners to help add on to whatever existing in vivo exposure it is that you're doing, to help kind of up the ante and keep people moving forward in their emotional engagement with an exposure. It kind of really helps with like continuing to face their ultimate core fears. So people can use that to sort of augment later on exposures much higher up their hierarchy if needed. They can also be used as a tool for re-exposure. So let's say for some reason a person is doing an imaginal exposure script, and the framework of an imaginal exposure script is ways, if I don't do certain compulsions, then my worst fears will occur. I heard Steve earlier give the example of if the triggering situation for the script is I'm cooking dinner and I have this really strong compulsive urge to check the stove a number of times to make sure it's off, but I just don't. I resist the urge to check the stove. And then the imaginal exposure continues into, and lo and behold, I made a huge mistake. I should have checked, and all because I didn't. Now the house has burnt to the ground and I'm homeless and I'm penniless and my life is ruined forever. So using as a tool for re-exposure, let's say in this person's real life, the next day they're cooking breakfast and they have this really strong urge to check the stove and they try to resist and they try to resist, but they just can't help it and they check, right? We would want them, in the absence of being able to resist that compulsion, to figure out a way to spoil that compulsion or re-expose so that that compulsion doesn't be sort of like the status quo of the moment, right? And reinforce OCD. So what that person could do in an in vivo way is, you know what, I checked, I sort of gave into one of my rituals. So if I'm going to spoil that in an in vivo way, what I might go do is turn the burner back on, leave it on for a couple of seconds, cover my eyes, turn it off, and then walk away without looking, right? I've kind of spoiled it or I've re-exposed myself. Or they can do this in an imaginal way. So let's say they've already left the house. They can't do an in vivo spoiling of this, but they've done that imaginal exposure script. They can do their mini imaginal exposure that's like, you know what? Even though I checked, I might not have checked completely enough, or I might not be 100% sure. I probably should have checked 3 or 4 times. And all because I didn't, I'm sure by the time I get home from work later, my house is going to be gone. So they can kind of do that in a mini imaginal way. This can also be really helpful when used to block or prevent mental rituals. So it's almost like facing your fear with a mental one-liner instead of giving into mental reassurance or replacing bad images with good images or mentally reviewing, did I check, right? So let's say this person's now driving to work and they did resist the urge to check when they were cooking breakfast, but they're having really strong urges to mentally review in their head, right? Like, did it seem like the stove was off? Did I feel any heat? Oh, that's a mental ritual. I'm trying to check in my mind. Sometimes people are capable of just like record scratch, stop doing mental rituals and moving on. But sometimes it's not enough to tell people what not to do. So often when we're thinking about ritual prevention, we're saying, don't do your rituals, right? So don't do that mental ritual. Don't mentally check in your head. Giving a little mini imaginal exposure one-liner can be something someone can do instead of mentally reviewing or mental checking. And so this person notices I'm driving to work and I really have this strong urge to review what the stove looked like, what the house smelled like before I left. You know, what do I remember? It was so hot when I walked away from cooking my eggs, whatever it is. And what they can do to help themselves resist that mental reviewing and checking is just whip out their mini imaginal in their mind and be like, yep, you know what? I probably didn't check. I probably didn't check enough. And in fact, I'm going to come home and my house is going to be ashes. And if only I had checked, I would have averted this disaster. But now, all because I didn't do my rituals, this is going to be the consequence. And while that might be harder, like more distressing and more anxiety provoking in the moment than the mental checking might be, ultimately doing that hard thing in the moment is going to make it much easier in the long run to break free of sort of being on the OCD roller coaster and being really trapped in that obsessive compulsive cycle. So the last thing I want to say about this is that sometimes a person can't do a whole exposure in the moment. And so, for example, let's say that this person is at somebody else's house and they're at a dinner party and their friend is cooking and everybody's standing around, and then they go to the table and eat whatever it is. And they have this urge, like, I'm not sure if my friend checked enough to turn that stove off. I really want to go look for them. It's not like they're going to go hide in the guest bedroom or the bathroom or out in their car for a half an hour and do a full imaginal exposure. But what they might be able to do is like get up and go to the bathroom and just take a moment to be like, I bet they didn't check enough and I bet the house is going to be in flames any second. They didn't check enough and I didn't check and none of us are sure and the house is going down. Can I just use that as a way to resist my urges and then move on, redirect my attention, go back to conversation with my friend, try to be really focused on what's actually happening in the moment, and just use that sort of mini imaginal to do a little bit of facing fears so that this person can move forward and not get stuck in the trap of compulsing. So before we get to questions, what I want to do is share with you an example really want to check my body. I really want to check my physical sensations. If you're thinking about the Y box checklist, this goes under somatic checking. Right. So I really want to do my somatic checking, because if I don't do my somatic checking, my fear is that I'm going to have a bathroom accident in public, be completely humiliated. My life will be over. And what I want you to be able to hear and see are all of the details about what Steve was saying before about setting this person up. So I'm showing this to show you that this is what the imaginal script is. For one moment, I'm going to go back to the slides, because where I want you guys to be able to follow along, I'm just going back to cue this up. So the do's and don'ts slide, what I want you to do is just have this as a loose reference while we're listening to this script. I really want you to be able to pay attention to the script, but I want you to hear the do's and listen for what you hear. Telling the story with emotion, using a lot of detail to increase engagement, describing thoughts, physical sensations, smells, sounds, actions, using the patient's own language and descriptions, and keeping track of our assessment during the engagement. That's the one element, asking for suds, that you won't hear, because this is just a one iteration recording of this imaginal exposure script. Now, if you also remember what Steve said about this earlier, is that we don't want like 5 handwritten pages that equates to a 30-minute one iteration of an imaginal exposure script. So you can see, if you scroll down, that this imaginal exposure script, as we have it typed out and zoomed in for you, is about 2.5 pages long. But this script, when you hear the audio recording, is only about 5 minutes long in one iteration. So when you do this with your patient, you might have them in your session read this for a half an hour or 20 minutes through, never less than 20 minutes, but 20 minutes to a half an hour should be sufficient to aim at some of the mechanisms of change that we're aiming at. So they would be repeating this sort of on a loop tape. What you also might do is have this one iteration recorded, and then when they go home and listen to this for homework, they can close their eyes, they can listen to this on repeat and just set a timer for themselves. Being able to have this audio recorded so that they can close their eyes and actually have a visual imagery in their mind gets it a bit closer to being that imagery part of the imaginal exposure. Okay, so I am going to turn my camera off just to preserve bandwidth. And then what I want you guys to do is just give me a little wave. I'm going to play this. You won't actually see it. Just to let me know that you're hearing the audio correctly and that there's no lagging. Oh. Hold on just a moment. It's not playing for me, which means it wouldn't be playing for you. Let me see if I can just refresh it and we'll start over. Okay. So let me see if this works better without screen sharing the script. Can you guys just give me a wave that you can hear this?
And I'm ready to go for a run. Last night, I went out with Leslie and ate a lot, including having the dessert.
Okay, one more time, because I really want people who might have issues with their audio to be able to see the screen share. I'm still going to try to play this. Just again, give me a little wave that the sound is coming through.
It's the afternoon, and I'm ready to go for a run.
Great.
Last night, I went out with Leslie and ate a lot, including having the dessert. My stomach is gurgling, and I've been farting a lot. I feel like I may have diarrhea. Despite these ideas and feelings, I don't go to the bathroom. It's hot out, so I'm wearing shorts. I start to run, and by the first intersection, I'm doubting if I should be running. I think I could shit myself. I should probably turn around and go home. But I decide to keep going and think, this is really dumb. I'm going to shit my pants. As I run, I get further and further from home. I'm in a residential area with no bathrooms around. As I wait to cross Darby Road, I think, maybe this wasn't a great idea, but I cross Darby Road anyway and get on the trail. As I'm on the trail, I realize that there are literally no bathrooms around, so if I had to go, I'd have to go in the woods where the people who live around there would see me. I run further and further from home, and it feels like the end is so far away. I get to the end of the trail, and school is just let out. There are middle school kids everywhere. All of a sudden, my stomach feels like a vice hit me, and I have shooting pains in my legs. Then I lose all control of my bowels, and I have diarrhea that runs all down my legs. It's watery and chunky with a light brown color. It smells terrible, acidic, and like shit. The middle schoolers are laughing and pointing at me. They yell, "What the fuck, dude?" while they flick cigarette butts at me. I'm thinking that this is so embarrassing. I'm a grown man and I've shit my pants. These kids are right to be making fun of me because this is unacceptable. I try to run past the kids quickly, but new kids stop, laugh, and look horrified. Mothers in strollers try to avoid me. I make it back to the start of the trail and then to the light at Darby Road. I try to mind my own business, but I hear people behind me laughing and saying, "Oh my God, that guy just shit his pants." I'm thinking my life is over. This is truly humiliating. People will tell everyone on Facebook about this. I could become a meme of running pants shitting guy. This will follow me around for the rest of my life. As I cross Darby Road, a couple of guys come out of the pizza place on the corner. They're rough-looking blue-collar guys, unshaven with paint splotches and grease stains on their clothes. One of them is about my age, and the rest are maybe 10 or 15 years older. I approach them as I step from the street to the corner. "Holy shit, this faggot just shit his pants," the guy about my age yells. The older men start laughing. I try to run past them, but the guy about my age trips me as I pass. I fall on the ground and I skin my knee like I used to do when I was a child. It's red and raw and bloody. The blood is running down my leg and mixing with the shit. I start to worry that the shit will get into my open wound and give me some kind of fatal infection. As I start to get up, I'm now crying. One of the older men yells, "Oh, Jesus, look at this little pussy." I get to my feet and start to jog away, but I feel the younger man grab the back of my shirt collar. The front of my collar slams hard into my throat, and I feel like I can't breathe. I feel my shirt tear, and I begin to break away. All right, I hear one of the older men yell, "You don't want to get shit on you." I'm about a mile from home, but it's never felt further away. I can't wait to wash off the layers of blood, sweat, tears, and shit. I make it maybe a block and a half, and I see an SUV marked police pull up to the curb on the left in front of me. The police officer yells at me to come over. He rolls down the window and says, "Come here, try not to touch the car." "I need to see some identification," he says. I reach into my pockets, and all I can find is my phone, which is now covered in watery shit. My driver's license must have fallen out when I fell. "I think I lost my license," I tell the officer. "Well, you should really have it on you," he says condescendingly. "What's your name and address?" he asks. I give him the information, and he begins to enter it into his laptop. This is taking forever. As I stand there waiting, people are walking and driving past. I see them giving me disgusted looks. "Listen, you know you can't be out here like that," he says again in that same condescending tone. "I wrote you up a citation for indecent exposure. You'll have to report to court later this month, and you'll have to register as a sex offender." He hands me a ticket, and I take it. "Normally, I'd give you a ride home, but I can't have you in my car like that. Get out of here," he says. I manage to get back home, all the while running past more strangers who are laughing and pointing at me. Everyone around me looks disgusted with me. I race into the door and get a trash bag to throw away my clothes, socks, and running shoes, which are all covered in diarrhea. I take a shower after putting all these items outside. I tell Leslie what happened. She replies, "Oh my God, did anybody see you?" She's embarrassed and questions if she should even stay with me. She says, "I can't believe you did this. How old are you? You should have known better. Why did I marry you? I can't believe I wanted to have kids with you. You're going to be a terrible father to them." Leslie packs a bag and stays with friends for a few days. She won't talk with me because she's too disgusted. Eventually, I get divorce papers in the mail and I'm left alone. I have to move back in with my parents. I'm never able to find another partner again. My parents are ashamed that their fully grown son is still living with them. They always used to seem so happy to see me, but now they're just embarrassed. When they talk to relatives, they have to make up some story about why I'm living with them again. They can't bear to talk about their son who can't control himself. Paul never has time for me anymore either. He and Julia are still good friends with Leslie. I know none of them wants to admit to ever being friends with that guy who shit his pants and is now a registered sex offender. I contemplate suicide because my life is over. This all happened because I didn't listen to my body and instead try to go running when I felt like I might need to go to the bathroom.
Okay. So let me stop sharing. I want to pause here to again go back to the do's and don'ts and highlight a couple of things. First is that one iteration, it was about 6 minutes. Okay. So if you were going to do this for imaginal exposure in session, you would really break this up into two pieces. The first piece of this would be writing the imaginal exposure script, which is not the exposure itself. So I'm going to reiterate that because in consultation, this is one of the tricky things that we see, that definitely eliciting so much detail and so much of that downward arrow. Well, if that happened, then what's the worst thing that would happen that next? And then if that happens, what's the thing that you would be most afraid would happen after that? And so on and so forth. Eliciting some of this information and even having people say out loud and write down some of their worst fears, some of the things they're most afraid will happen or will be said to them or will come to pass, can be scary and can be emotionally activating. But writing the imaginal exposure script in and of itself is not the exposure. Does that make sense to everyone? Right. So you would have your script writing time. As Steve said, he gave the example of we started this imaginal exposure script and then I gave it to a patient for homework to finish and he came back with way, way, way too much content. My preference would be anytime you can write that imaginal script together in completion, in session, especially the first time, that's going to give you the most collaborative work so that you make sure that this has enough detail, that it is long enough, that it does go to the absolute nth degree. The further down the rabbit hole, I want you guys to think about downward arrow technique in cognitive therapy. The further down the rabbit hole you can take this, the more and more and more implausible and ridiculous these fears seem. And that's where part of the disconfirmation in imaginal exposure comes from. Okay. So you would have two pieces of this. You'd have the script writing portion of it, which you're not doing to intentionally emotionally activate this person. That might happen naturally, but you're not trying to have them lean in. You're not trying to increase the volume of their distress and anxiety. You're just kind of living with it while you're getting your content together. Then when you start this for an exposure, you want to conduct this in the same way that you would conduct any in vivo exposure. So you're going to have a start point and an end point. You're going to be instructing your patient that you're going to do this on repeat for about 20 to 30 minutes. So that 6-minute iteration, you might, for your first imaginal exposure, have your patient reading that out loud. I think it's particularly powerful when people can hear these words in their own voice, because people whose obsessions are cognitive and they sound like another voice in their head, they hear it in their own voice, essentially. Right? So having it in your patient's words and not your words can be really powerful. But you also could have this person close their eyes and have an audio recording of you reading that. One is not better than the other. They're just different ways that you can do this. But you would have this person read this on repeat for about 20 to 30 minutes, or you would read it to them. I would pick one or the other. I would not go back and forth because it takes people out of the exposure experience. And you would also be setting this up just like any other exposure, where you would be asking for a suds level, you would be encouraging them to resist any compulsions, you would encourage them to like have that willingness to be emotionally engaged and really let their fear and distress kind of run its course. And then you would have an endpoint and have post-exposure processing. Okay. Then for homework, as you saw with this, there's a number of ways you could do this. Either this person would sit down and read their script out loud to themselves on repeat for 20 to 30 minutes, or they've made an audio recording, which is often my preference so that people can close their eyes and have that, that visualization as well. But they would conduct that just as they would conduct any in vivo exposure. So they would have a set circumscribed period of time. They would be having their SUDS levels recorded on a homework form. And when you do this every day and then they bring in their homework recording form, you would have some processing of that homework. What did they take away from this? What was the experience like? What did they learn? Was there anything surprising that happened? So on and so forth. So we're going to shift in just a few minutes to our guest speaker. I want to take maybe one or two questions that are very, very focused in on imaginal exposure scripts and or the actual patient example that we listened to. So I'm going to say Spandana. Am I saying that right? Oh,
it's Spandana.
Spandana. Hi. What's your
Hi. So I actually have a client who we do mostly imaginal exposures because their actual OCD is not something that we can actually go and do in vivo. But they have a really difficult time in visualization. And I know we talked about that with where in vivo, or not in vivo, imaginal might be a better option. But I was wondering how to do it if it's really hard for them to visualize the script. They read through their script in person. We record it, like you mentioned, and they do go home and try to visualize it. But they've been telling me for a long time that they just keep getting distracted because they also struggle a lot with ADHD. So I'm not really sure how to kind of manage that and make it better for them to do the imaginal exposures.
Yeah, I can give you some simple tips. This sounds like the kind of case that it would be helpful to have a lot more time in consultation just to get more details about the case and hear more about what's going on. My quick tip thoughts about this are, one, that even if the content of their OCD that you're working on right now really is not possible to do in vivo exposures to, I would look for other content of their OCD, like across the Y-box checklist, to still get that experience of doing in vivo exposures, just so that you can see the way that this person's anxiety gets activated and diminishes, right? So you have a better sense of like, how do they do with habituation? How do they do with mastery? That sort of thing. I would also be thinking about, I've heard this from patients before, not that I'm having trouble with visualization and imagery because that's not a thing that is easy for me, but like I get too distracted. So my response to that would be both a little bit of problem solving. So for example, especially for someone who has coexisting inattentiveness or even hyperactivity, I would want to be thinking about, if you're on medication, when are you taking medication in relationship to doing your exposure? I would want you to have that medication on board at least a half an hour before you do that. So thinking about the other things that we know help people with ADHD. So minimizing distractions. If they're doing their imaginal exposure in a bedroom that is tidy and there's a lot of visual distractions and they happen to be facing a window and there's a lot going on outside the window, I would want to just do some problem solving to help. We're recording, use noise canceling headphones so that they can really be exclusively focused on that. For some people with the hyperactivity side of ADHD, it can be really helpful to do, as the occupational therapists say, some heavy work before they have to jump in cognitive. So some weightlifting or going for a run or like, you know, tidying up the house or whatever it might be. So those are some ideas. And then I also might, for people where the barrier is inattentiveness, you could experiment with, it is more cognitively activating to have someone look at their written script and have to read it out loud and follow along. It's like a visual cue, as opposed to listening to the audio recording and having them close their eyes and imagine. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was what we were going to start. I was just wondering if that would be a good option.
Yeah, it would be. And then
Okay.
the other way you're going to know is just to ask them for their SUDS levels and kind of track their emotional engagement and see if this still is feeling like an exposure. If it winds up just feeling like a cognitive exercise, that's not what you're aiming at. So that would be a point to reconsider.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So those of you who have your hands up, I want to ask you to write your questions down and just hold tight with your questions because I can see that our guest speaker is here. I want to do one last reminder to everyone to make sure that you are in a private area where you are able to maintain this person's confidentiality. And I want to go ahead and welcome Chris, who I'm pretty sure has joined us.
I'm here.
Hey.
Hi. Hi.
So we've kind of prepped people that you were going to be coming and sharing your story. I'm going to maybe ask you to introduce yourself with as much or little detail as you feel comfortable with. And then I'll give you the floor. And then when it's time to do question and answer, I'll kind of help you moderate. Does that sound good?
That's fine.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here to speak to 270 strangers about my fear-based anxiety disorder. It's wonderful. But I said that joke last time I did this, and it's actually very true. I'm happy to be here. My name's Chris. I'm 39 years old. I'm an attorney in Philadelphia, and I've had anxiety. I've had OCD as far back as I can remember, but I didn't know it was OCD until relatively recently. And I've gone through the whole process with Tina. Can I call you Tina, or do they know you as Doc? I've done the whole process with Tina, and I am living proof that it works incredibly well. I'm a completely different person than I was 2.5, 3 years ago. So do you just want me to jump right into it?
Yeah, go ahead. Do you want me to cue you with like where to start? I think it's always really helpful with you start with like the backstory. Like, when did you first notice anxiety in your life, or
Yeah.
where did it start for you?
Well, I'll start with I'll start there. I'll start with my brand of OCD. So I, for a very, very long time, for over the past 20 years, I constantly felt that I was on the precipice of destroying my life. So my core fear was that I was just one misstep away, one misspelled word, one unfitting shirt away from alienating all of my friends, losing my career, alienating the loved ones that I had, losing my freedom, losing everything. And so that, to me, meant, if my friends saw that I misspelled a word in a text message, that they would think that I was an idiot and they would never want to talk to me again. If my colleagues did the same thing, if I wore something that was ill-fitting or didn't match, that it could indicate to people that I was a slob and they didn't want to be friends with me, or didn't want to hire me. I feared that I married the wrong person, or that before I was married, that I was in a relationship with the wrong person. If I married them or continued the relationship, it would destroy my life and I would be unhappy. And then the easiest way, I think the logical conclusion, the easiest way to completely destroy your life is to harm children or be a child molester. So I had a lot of fears and intrusive thoughts about that, because that was one thing that if I did that, my life was completely over. And so I had this intense fear of doing it, and therefore I had these intrusive thoughts about it. But I think that I always had these tendencies. as an as a student through high school, from kindergarten to high school, I never once missed a homework assignment. And I don't think it's because I was a great student. In fact, I wasn't a great student, but I was so afraid of the consequences of not doing my homework, of the teacher possibly calling me out in front of the class. In other words, I thought that if I just missed one homework assignment, it had the potential domino effect of destroying my life. I had a lot of anxiety around friends and family members. And at one point, doctors said that I had social anxiety, but it turns out that it wasn't social anxiety at all. So I always kind of had it. And then in college is really my sophomore year of college. So that would have been 2003 is the first time that I can remember. Looking back, it's the first time I can remember that I really had what I would consider an intrusive thought of the OCD variety, I guess. I had a girlfriend. My girlfriend had a 3-year-old brother, and the 3-year-old brother loved me, and I loved hanging out with the kid. And I had so much fun with the little kid. And then one day I had this intrusive thought about harming that child. And that intrusive thought replayed in my head for months, and I couldn't do anything about it. And I was convinced that I was this terrible, terrible person. What if I am this terrible person? What if I do want to harm that kid? And it kind of took off from there. It was really hard for me. And that's when I say, that's when that's when my secret began. That you can't tell anybody. You can't tell anybody about these things. You feel that it's not normal. You feel that it's not right, and you feel that you have to keep it a secret. And so that's when really my secret began. And college is a pretty terrible place to have OCD, where you think that you're going to destroy your life, because you're really at this point in your life where you're becoming who you are and finding yourself, and you're finding what you want to do. And so you have the world in your hands, but at the same time, you could easily destroy the world the same way. So it's, I started in social settings. I would start to pre-plan how I was going to act. I would pre-plan how much I was going to talk. I would pre-plan how much I was going to not talk in between talking. I would obviously pre-plan things I was going to say or clothes that I was going to wear. And you have to do this in a way that feels natural, right? So there was a lot of planning, a lot of anxiety around hanging out with people, a lot of I need to hang out with people, because if I don't, they won't be my friends. But if I do hang out with them, then I really have to closely monitor how things are going and what I can say. God forbid I interrupted somebody. That was one of the worst things that could happen. And I actually have ADHD, so interrupting people is kind of on brand for me. So that was very, very difficult. And I don't think that I was an alcoholic, but I certainly alcohol certainly helped in social settings, and it was very socially acceptable to be drinking in college. So that certainly helped. But really, at the end of the day, anybody, I'm sure all of as mental health professionals, that the alcohol just makes you more anxious in the end. So in college, it really took off. And then I ended up at a relatively prestigious law school, which really messed with me, because I felt I was this fraud. I felt that my score on the LSAT, which is what you take to get into law school, was a complete mistake and a fraud. I thought being there was a fraud. And I thought that I was just going to be found out. For those of you who don't know, when you're in law school, you don't raise your hand to talk. It's called the Socratic method. You're just called on. So you're in this lecture hall, and they just randomly call on you. And that was my biggest fear. And it happened, obviously, but it also drove me to do my homework to an extent that it was probably a little overboard, but I was so afraid of being called on because all I had to do was say one wrong thing, and I was going to destroy my life. So at this point, I'm in law school 2007 to 2010. I still don't know that I have OCD. I just think I'm this terrible fraud. And it wasn't really until around 2014 or 15, I think, I listened to comedy. I've always enjoyed comedy, and I heard a comedian, just randomly heard a comedian named Maria Bamford. I don't know if any of you have heard of her. She's hilarious. You probably recognize her if you saw her, but she has OCD. And she actually has an album, a comedy album called Unwanted Thought Syndrome. And she was doing her stand-up bit about how she wanted to genocide children, which is her funny way of saying, like, she had these thoughts about killing children, and she would squeeze her hands to prevent her from doing that. And I can't even tell you how it was just a massive revelation for me. I thought, oh my God, that's me. As I told Tina the first time we met, I clenched when I had those. I didn't squeeze my fist, but I clenched my whole body when I had those intrusive thoughts. And it was, I'm getting choked up, but it was the first moment I realized I might not be a terrible person, that I might not, that this secret that I have might actually be something that's normal and diagnosable. And it was really amazing. The problem is, a doctor had never told me this, and I'm skeptical of coming to a medical conclusion on my own. And what if I'm wrong? So what if I go to a mental health professional, I say, I have these unwanted thoughts and this is what they are, and they say, okay, we're going to lock you up now. It's not that easy to come forward with it. So I think it was 2020, or maybe it was late 2019 or early 2020, before the pandemic. I went to a new doctor for my ADHD medication, who happened to be a psychiatrist, and we were just doing an intake. It's the first time I ever met her, and I'd been living with this thought that I think I probably have OCD for about 4 or 5 years at this point. And I'm sitting in front of a mental health professional. We're doing intake. She's asking me questions. I think I'm gonna throw this out there, and I did. And she asked me a couple follow-up questions. She goes, "Oh, you have OCD. There's this treatment." And she told me about exposure response prevention. And that was her being so matter of fact about it, was such an amazing feeling. And then she actually told me, and I don't know if you guys are supposed to do this, but that she had OCD and she went through ERP, and how well it worked. And it completely shifted the way I thought about things. It was really amazing. So, but then again, it still took me, and the pandemic happened, but it took me about a year to actually reach out and start the process. So it wasn't until 2021 that I started with Tina, which, so that's 18 years that from my first actual memory of having an intrusive OCD type thought to getting treatment. I lived with it for 18 years, every single day. And I have to say that ERP was scary. It was very stressful, because I knew I was going to go in there and I knew I was going to talk to another human being, medical professional or not, about these things. There was a lot of vulnerability there, and it was difficult. It was difficult, but at that point I was ready. I was really ready to kind of try and get over this. I didn't know if it was going to work or not. But I think and correct me if I'm wrong, Tina, the first 2 or 3 sessions were just kind of informational and also going over just figuring out what my core fear was, because I didn't know what a core fear was at that point. I didn't really, there was a lot of things, like I had this obsession with my ex-girlfriend from high school who I dated at 20 plus years ago, and I didn't know why I thought about her every day. I didn't think it was in any way related to the intrusive thoughts I have about harming my children or my daughter. And so, when you boil it down to the core fear, we kind of found that all of these things are connected. And actually, when we identified my core fear, I think there was a couple things where I was like, oh, well, if that's my core fear, then this is probably related to that. Do you think that's OCD? And Tina was like, yes, that is definitely OCD. Which is wonderful, because these were all these things that I was stressed about. I didn't realize that they had a connection, and they did. So the first couple sessions were just very informational, really giving me a very clear explanation of what was going to happen, what was expected of me, and kind of diagramming and mapping my OCD. And then we ranked them we came up with exposures, and we ranked those from beginner exposures to what Tina calls my Super Bowl, which would be my the hardest thing I could possibly do. So I remember the first exposure I did. I remember the absolute moment, because you have to understand that OCD is this it's an infectious bully. It's a bully who infects your brain. And like all infections, it tries to survive. So, I don't have OCD. That's what my OCD is constantly telling me, that I do not have OCD. And so while I'm doing these first few sessions, and Tina's like, oh yeah, you've got OCD pretty bad, I'm thinking, wow, I tricked her. That's great. Because I definitely don't have OCD. And that's really leading up through the first few sessions. I'm really feeling I don't have OCD. Preparing for this speech or this talk, I was totally convinced I didn't have OCD, and that I was going to trick 270 people, or worse yet, you were going to find out I didn't have it. Then I would be exposed as a fraud. So the first one that we did was I had to turn off spell check on my email, my phone, my text messages, everything. And I had to text my law partners, my 2 law partners. I had to text them a text that had a misspelled word in it, and not like they or there, but like a word we should know how to spell. And so I was on vacation actually. And I'm sitting there on Zoom with Tina, and I have my phone, and we come up with a text message. And at this point, I'm still thinking I don't have OCD. And I remember the text. It was, hey, I just want to let you guys know I got approved for my mortgage, because my wife and I were buying a house, and I spelled mortgage without a T. And it didn't think it was a big deal. And I hit send, and I just started to cry. I'm getting choked up again thinking about it, but that's when I really knew that I had, I had a lot of validation that I had OCD in that moment, because it was really the act of doing it. I kind of brushed off, but once it was done, I was devastated. I was convinced my partners were going to kick me out of the law firm. They thought I was an idiot. That was it. And I'm pretty sure that my partner responded like immediately and said, oh, that's great news, and spelled like great, GRATE or something. And that was just disconfirmation immediately. So that it was actually a perfect response. And I know he wasn't doing it on purpose. He was probably just very busy and just typed something real quick and hit send and didn't really care, like a normal person. But I got that that immediate stress and that fear and the immediate disconfirmation. And then I think 3 times a day, I had to send purposeful text messages to people with misspelled words. And just to give you an idea of how my OCD works, I am talking to you right now thinking, does mortgage actually have a T? And did I just make myself look like an idiot in front of everybody? That is actually happening in my head right now, but I'm just kind of brushing it off. So after that, the next exposure after we got through that, it eventually became ridiculous. I was sending these text messages without a problem, and it didn't bother me at all, and nothing changed in my life. And then I had to wear the wrong outfit. I had to wear things that I thought would make me look ridiculous, and so people wouldn't take me serious. Having this type of OCD for 18 years, I didn't just have that type of clothing in my closet. So I actually went to Costco and I bought like Kirkland brand. I bought stuff I would never wear, oversized, undersized, whatever. And I wore that every single day for a couple of weeks. And I felt ridiculous. But the brand of ridiculous kind of shifted. At first it was very nerve-wracking, but as my fear was disconfirmed, it became just kind of funny. I felt like towards the end of that several week period where I was dressed like that, I felt like Larry. I felt really comfortable, and I felt like Larry David, kind of in Curb Your Enthusiasm, just like a big blazer and sneakers and ill-fitting pants, and that's kind of how I felt, and it was fine. And so those things went on into, those are the more kind of easier ones that I had to do, and then things kind of gradually got more serious and the harder things, things dealing with children, imaginal exposures about my ex-wife and my ex-girlfriend and destroying my life, being purposely talkative and with my friends, interrupting people on purpose. But what ultimately happens with all of those is that I listened over and over again about how I destroyed my life because I wasn't with my ex-girlfriend from high school. And just saying that out loud right now, I hear how ridiculous that is. I have a really great life. I have a great wife and child, and listening to myself 3 times a day go on for a half hour about how my life is destroyed because I'm not married to my girlfriend from high school. At first, it made me cry because it was really difficult to listen to. I didn't even want to hear her name. And eventually I was rolling my eyes / laughing at the idea and the listening to it over and over again. And then I think the hardest one was probably dealing with the harming children, because the idea of harming children is so repulsive to a normal person. So it was hard to do an exposure. It was hard for me to delineate what is my repulsion to whatever the exposure was, the natural repulsion, versus what is, my OCD telling me. So we had to delineate those things, but once we did, it was important to do that because it made me understand that I was in fact repulsed by the idea of hurting a child. And that's probably why my OCD honed in on it so much, is because it was such an important thing to me that OCD found it a great way to get its hooks into me. So that was really really helpful, and it's certainly very, very difficult, but it was the the therapy went in such a way where I was capable of building up to that. I got enough trust and I got enough trust in the process that I knew that if I was going to dive into the more difficult things, that I was going to make progress with those, if that makes sense. So I guess, so how do I deal with it now? So I'm always going to have the intrusive thoughts. I'm always going to have things that pop in my head, but the idea is to, I guess, treat those like a normal person. Not that I would know how a normal person treats with them, but you know, I'm very dismissive of them now. I had this revelation that I don't know if any of you have seen My Cousin Vinny, but there's this large bully who owes Joe Pesci $200, and if he comes up to $200, they'll fight. So there's a point where he says, "I got you $200," and Joe Pesci is so fed up with him, he just kind of waves him off, and then he punches him in the face and knocks him out, takes his $200. And that's actually the image I put in my mind when I get an intrusive thought. I just kind of knock the bully out and move on. You know, shrug your shoulders, say, yeah, maybe I'm a terrible person, maybe I'm not. Maybe my partners are going to kick me out of the firm, maybe they're not. But and I just kind of, you know, I kind of live with it in a way that makes it not a big deal. And so I'm not stressed out. I'm not mapping out my life. I'm not doing things that I'm not letting OCD control me. I'm just recognizing that it's there, and I'm just dismissing it. And that is probably the most important thing. I mean, I guess that is not the most important thing, is the reason why you go through ERP. So it's a lot easier said than done, but through the process, it really becomes more clear and more possible for somebody like me to do that. I will say that, you know, it was 18 years until I started ERP, and it was probably 19 years by the time I was done with ERP. It felt like I put down, I know this is a little cliche, but it felt like I was holding 100-pound weights in my arms or on my back my entire life. And so that's just what life was like, and I was used to it. And then I put those weights down, and I felt what life really should feel like. And it was truly amazing. I did, after ERP, I did some support groups, which was super helpful. Just to talk to other people, to meet other people who are suffering, to talk about your secret, you know. And I just got busy with work, and it was almost exactly a year later, I reached out to Tina, and I was like, I need a booster session, because I gotten a little too complacent, and things were creeping up, and my OCD was morphing. So I think it's important to understand that, you know, what my OCD was at the beginning of our sessions isn't how the core fear is the same, but my obsessions, my intrusive thoughts, they morph, because OCD is this infectious bully that wants to stay alive. So it was trying different things, and it came back to me a little bit in different ways. And shout out to Tina, and now Tina and I do a booster session once a month. And I think it's important for me because it holds me accountable. I know that when I have an intrusive thought, I dismiss it. I'm not going to engage in any of my rituals, because Tina's going to ask me, be it in a month or in a couple of days, whenever it is, how have you been about doing this? And so it holds me a little accountable. I don't know if everybody would need to do that, but it works for me. And but I'm living a very normal life when it comes to my OCD and my anxiety. So it's really been remarkable.
Chris, thank you
Yes.
so much.
No problem.
Everybody here probably hates you and you've ruined your life, but whatever. We're gonna keep going. I think it's just so tremendously brave and generous for you to be able to come and talk to everyone. I want to open it up for questions. If you have a little bit of extra time, and I really want to encourage all of you. I'm going to have everyone sort of like queue up for questions in the same way by using the raise the hand function. And I'm also going to turn the chat back on in case you just want to say thank you, or also have questions that for some reason you're not able to say out loud. So that should be active. But before we get to questions, a couple of things that I think might just be helpful to add to Chris's story. Chris, how many sessions did you and I have before we started ERP? Do you remember?
I think it was, I want to say 4, if more.
Before we started exposures.
Yeah.
So
we started in April and I was on vacation in May. So I believe it was 4, I think.
yeah. So for the group, our first session where we first met was an intake evaluation. It was 2 hours and mostly it focused on doing the Y box. And mostly it also focused on like this is OCD and this is OCD and this is OCD and this is OCD. And then we had probably 2 or 3 more sessions before we started our first in vivo exposure. I'm highlighting that because this is the way it goes with our clinic, but just to share for the group, it's not like Chris and I knew each other for 6 months and had a tremendous amount of time to build rapport and our relationship before I started asking him to talk about really vulnerable things and do really hard things. And I think that's really important to say because sometimes we get questions from people about like how much trust and rapport and of a relationship do you need before you can get into this work. It didn't take very much time. The other thing I hope it's okay to share is just some severity scores. Would that be all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So when Chris and I did our initial Y box evaluation, I remember this. I'm not sure how well you remember this. I told him his score because there's nothing that couldn't be shared about that. And I was like, listen, your Y box score is a 28, and that's in the severe range. And I remember you were pretty shocked by that.
Yeah.
You remember that?
I do, yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember what was surprising or shocking about that?
Well, I didn't have OCD, so it was remarkable that I tricked you.
Yeah.
What really resonates with me is in a weird way, it gave me hope.
Mm-hmm.
It confirmed to me that I really didn't. It confirmed to me that what I was struggling with for the past 18 years wasn't just regular anxiety. It wasn't just me having a secret about being a terrible person. It confirmed to me in some sort of way that I had something diagnosable that could be treated, and that there was a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also just the validity of, it feels like this has been pretty hard to manage on a day-to-day basis, even though like I'm a pretty high functioning, successful person. And the validation of like, oh, this is actually severe. This has been a tremendous burden to carry. Not
Right.
like, oh, why is this so hard for you? You have this like mild anxiety, right? But like, yeah, this has been a real struggle. And I think that's why it's really important to be very transparent. So when Chris and I started, as you said, we had our evaluation at the end of March, started in April. Y box score was a 28. And by July, it was a 5, which is huge. And that's not because I am some genius therapist. That is because he did the treatment, right? Like Chris was really, really great at showing up regularly for sessions, doing all the homework, even when it was hard. That doesn't mean that it was perfect. Like, I wouldn't say that your homework compliance, from what I remember, was like as perfect as maybe your homework compliance was in elementary school. But like
I
for the most
disagree.
part,
I even missed one day, so I doubled up the next day. I I just
then I
I
remember.
was incredibly dedicated. I can't believe
Yeah.
I'm getting an A minus.
It's probably because I hate you. But right, like this is another example of it works if you work it, right?
Yeah.
Like it works because 1% of your week is actually in session, and the other 99% is the work that you do outside of the session.
Right. I actually was thinking about that yesterday, and I think the fact that I was in my late 30s, that I had been putting up with this for 18 years, the fact that I was paying for the treatment,
mm,
all of those things, I I think those contributed to how serious I was taking it. Um, and I was trying, I want to be careful about how I say this. I wasn't, I don't think that I would have been as good in the treatment if I had started it earlier. For me personally, in my life, I had to be ready to do it. So um, it took a long time, but I think the timing was right, if that makes sense.
yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
I would have loved for somebody to tell me I had OCD before, after, before 13 years. But yeah, I don't know. It just had to be the right time for the treatment.
Absolutely. And that your experience is the common experience. Statistically, it takes people 14 to 17 years to be accurately
Right.
diagnosed and be offered effective treatment. That's literally why we're here, because the more providers out there who can identify OCD, who can offer ERP, this is a travesty. Like this is a rate that we absolutely have to change, and that's the value of everyone being here. All right. So usually what happens is everybody's nervous to ask a question and 1,000 hands go up. So I'm gonna say, like, we have Chris probably for 20 more minutes at the most. If you have a question, now is the time. And Chris, I will empower you that if there are any questions that you don't want to answer, you can definitely let us know.
Okay.
Ethan, we're gonna start with you.
Hi there. Thanks. And thanks so much for telling your story. I was having tears right along with you because I have intrusive thoughts from time to time, and they've been bad. It fluctuates. And with the compulsions that go along with it, as well as being a therapist. You said something towards the end that I wanted to see if you get more clarification on, which was that you've noticed your OCD morphing.
Yes.
Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. So my core fear is there. So the core fear hasn't morphed. It is, my OCD knows that I'm not a child molester. It knows that I know that I'm not a child molester. So it's not going there anymore. It's not, I'm not really having intrusive thoughts to the degree that I was before about that. To the extent that I am, I can brush them off. So my OCD is kind of given up on trying to cause me stress, the trying to get my body to have the biological response of being super stressed out and making me do something to respond to it. So it has found different ways to make me stressed out. That's kind of sneaking up on me. So one of the things is that this sounds ridiculous, but it is what it is. My OCD morphed into, you've become too successful, so now none of your friends are going to like you. And that certainly wasn't something that I had ever discussed with Tina during the core part of my treatment, but it creeped up on me. And then I didn't realize that was my OCD. I thought it was a legitimate concern. I started, ruminating about it, giving myself self-reassurance about it. And then it took me minutes, like, oh, no, that's OCD. So it has come up in different ways. But the more I do follow-ups and, the more understanding as this time goes on about my OCD, I start to realize that that's just the bully trying to figure out ways to annoy me. If you're when I was a kid anyway, you'd go to Thanksgiving with all your uncles and they would all, touch your chest, you look down and you hit you in the nose. And then by the end of the night, they keep doing that, right? And by the end of the night, you're not looking down anymore and you're just like, get out of here. And they're not getting the reaction they want anymore, right? So now they're pulling your ear. That's essentially what my OCD has done. But with the more tools I have to confront it, the more palpable it's been. Sorry, not palpable, palatable. Now all you guys think I'm an idiot.
I do too. Thanks. Thank you for doing all of this.
That's the perfect metaphor. I love that about the uncle thing. I also want to say, just for those of you out there, that like Chris's experience with my OCD is not catching me with these other things. And so now it's coming up with new ways to torment me. That's the value in training your clients and patients to be their own therapist, because having OCD really is like living with a chronic condition that can be in remission for a long time, but it's going to try to find ways to catch you off guard. And that's not like unique to Chris. That is really common. So you should be thinking about that. We're going to talk about that when we talk about relapse prevention. I like the way that you shared that. Lindsay, I'm going to get to you next.
Hi, Chris. Thank you. I heard you say that you are married and you have a kiddo. So I was curious, did you ever include her or your kid in treatment, whether it was like with exposures or accountability?
My wife or kid, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, I will tell you this, and I meant to touch on this, but my daughter was born in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
I love my daughter more than I ever thought I could love any human, anything ever. And I, at the same time, was so frightened. I wanted to have a kid. I was so frightened when we were going through the process, when my wife was pregnant, because I had these intrusive thoughts. And the idea of bathing my daughter, wiping my daughter, cuddling with my daughter scared the shit out of me. Because for 18 years, I had suffered from this intrusive thought, and this was going to be the moment of truth. I had avoided kids before, but now I couldn't avoid them. And not only couldn't I avoid them, I had to touch a child's genitals to wipe her, like this was going to expose me. And at the same time, I knew that that was irrational. I wanted to believe that was irrational. And so it's one of the main, and I wasn't going to miss out on my daughter in any aspect of raising my daughter. So it's one of the things that drove me to get help about this, or research it, or try and find help about this. So with that being said, I included my wife in a lot of the stuff about my ex-girlfriend and ruining my marriage. When it came to children, we didn't include my daughter at all. I don't think for any specific reason. Probably because I did not wipe her, I did not bathe her, I did not do any of those things. I was forcing myself to do it, and I was incredibly uncomfortable doing it, but I was, from the moment she was born, I forced myself to do it just because I wasn't going to sacrifice that. I also felt that if I didn't wipe her, or I didn't bathe her, or refused to do those things, that might expose me as a child molester. So I was really forcing myself to do that. So to the extent that would have been an exposure, the opportunity, it didn't really sync up, I guess, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
Yeah. And do you want to mention, related to that the way before treatment you were able to diaper change and do bath time routine was also with a lot of compulsions?
Yes.
Clenching.
Lots.
Yeah.
Clenching. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, a lot of clenching, a lot of, I wasn't present when I was with my daughter a lot of times. So if I was showering with her, or if I was, changing her or cuddling with her, I wasn't present because I was doing some sort of mental gymnastics, some sort of ritual in my mind, to distract myself from the intrusive thoughts.
Mhm. Yeah. Ben, I have you up next.
Hey, thank you, Chris. That was awesome. That was very powerful. And I love Maria Bamford and Larry David. So thank you for those references. If you don't mind sharing, what was your core fear? I know you had a lot of different obsessions that you've had. And do you mind sharing what your core fear was and maybe what that process was to come up with that core fear?
So it was essentially that I'm going to destroy my life. So one thing's going to lead to the next, whatever it is. So if my colleagues think I'm an idiot, I'm going to lose my job, which is going to lose my success, which is going to lose my friends, which is going to lose my wife and child, and I'm going to be homeless and alone. If I lose my friends, then my friends will expose me as the fraud that I am, and then I'll lose my job, my colleagues, my wife, and I will end up homeless and alone. You name, if I get arrested for molesting a child, well, that's the easiest way to end up alone and with nothing. So my core fear, if I married the wrong person, then I'm going to be miserable in my marriage. I'm going to be miserable at work. I'm going to be miserable with my friendships. I am going to end up homeless and alone. So that's my core fear. And so everything in some sort of way was tangibly related to it in this, domino effect that could go any which direction.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I guess the second part of your question is, how did we come to that? And that was all Tina asking me, about my anxieties and fears, and well, what would that lead to? And then, you do that over a long enough session, and I kind of sound like a broken record. Well, then I would have no friends, and then what would happen? Well, then, I'd end up homeless and alone. We kept getting back to that. Yeah, that's how we got there.
Yeah, and just for the group, to go back to what we were talking about before Chris joined with the sort of mini imaginals now, and even at the end of our more targeted course of ERP, we're at the point where we almost irreverently can be like, yep, I bet you just ruined your life. There goes your career, there goes your friends, right? We can just sort of sum it all up, recognize that this is where OCD is trying to lead him to anyway, and that makes it a lot easier as well, I think, to label it and then know what to do with it.
Right.
Yeah. I'm seeing a lot of hands going up and down. Chris, do you have a few more minutes for questions?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Hold on, let me just scroll through. One thing I want to say, just going back to the question that was about having family being involved. Chris's wife never came to session. His daughter never came to session. We didn't include them in that way. And so most of the way that family were involved just also in facilitating treatment. Chris, do you want to talk about how you and your wife, what you shared with her or didn't share with you about treatment?
You all know more about my OCD than my wife does. You're mental health professionals, and so I hope that there's a level of understanding. But there's certain things that I haven't told my wife. My wife doesn't know about the obsessive thoughts about my ex-girlfriend. She doesn't know about the intrusive thoughts about harming children. Mostly because I asked Tina in our first couple of sessions, is this something I can talk about? And Tina just kind of said, it's unlikely that she would be totally understanding. In like a clinic, I feel like you have to have a clinical understanding of OCD to hear those things and not have them really I guess what I'm trying to say is my wife, at the end of the day, she might understand that it's OCD, but it might still bother her. It's just so, I haven't told her, and that's okay. She knows that I have OCD. I've told her some of the more, the lighter stuff. But what I explained to her is that I am going through treatment. I'm suffering from something very serious. I'm going through a treatment that's very stressful. So I may have, my mood may be off. If I go on a walk to walk our dog and I listen to a 30-minute imaginal exposure and I come back in the house, I might be really stressed out. But it's because I'm getting through this. And so she was very understanding about that. And I asked her to not give me any sort of reassurance throughout the process, to not, tell me I'm doing great, not tell me that I'm, I don't know, that I feel like people who don't understand OCD would tell me, oh, I'm sure it's not that bad. You're going to get through this. It's not, to kind of undermine the work that I was doing in an unintentional way. And I didn't want that. So I kind of explained all that to her, and she was very understanding about it.
Yeah. Just to give an example of that, like if Chris's wife knew that he was wearing mismatched socks to work, or like an ill-fitting shirt that he never would typically wear, what we would ask a family member to do is not say, I'm sure it's going to be fine. No one's going to notice. Everybody loves you anyway, right? Like to not say those reassuring things, but to say like, hey, it might be a hard day today, but we're here for you. We've got your back, like not to reassure, not to even talk about what might happen or not happen. And maybe there are exposures where family members won't even understand that somebody is doing an exposure, but just being able to say like, hey, I have a hard thing to do that's related to my treatment today. We can ask family members to be champions and cheerleaders, but not to fix it, not to be reassuring, not to be try to disconfirm fears or fix consequences in any way. Yeah. Susan, got your hand up.
Well, I think you guys just kind of answered my question. I am seeing an individual and his spouse is experiencing OCD, and she's all about trying to reassure her and go along with her compulsions and stuff. So I was gonna like with Tina and you, Chris, what can I kind of encourage my client to? But I think you kind of already answered it. But if you have anything else to add to that,
go ahead.
Yeah,
Chris.
I think Tina answered it best. I don't know that I have anything to add.
Susan, I'll have you keep an eye out for our family accommodation slides as well, because we'll talk very specifically about like what's helpful and not helpful from supportive people. Lauren, how about you? Hold on, Lauren, I think you're on mute. Oh, it looks like you're not on mute, but we can't hear you. Lauren, I'm going to skip over you, give you a couple minutes to see if you can get it worked out. Samantha?
Hi, Chris. I just really wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your story. Very profound, tons of information. I have one question about motivation. So particularly when it gets really, really complicated or really hard, while you were actually telling your story, I popped into my head and I'm like, oh, I have a client that fits a lot of these criteria. How did you feel the motivation aspect? Like, how are you after, especially those really difficult ones? And then my second kind of follow-up question was, you talked about a kind of a, not necessarily a fear of failure, but like always needing to do the right thing so that you can kind of put on this persona for that OCD part, right? Did that play a factor into the motivation? So you're like, oh, I have to do my homework because I can't misspell words, like those types of things. So that's my question.
It's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, so my motivation throughout was, well, there was the factor with the daughter and really, you know, I really thought for many, many years that I might be a child molester, or I might, it's incredibly stressful to think every single day that you are just about to end up in prison. You are just about to lose all of your friends. You are just about to lose your career. It's incredibly stressful. And I had enough information to know that I might be, through Maria Bamford, and then through the internet, and then through some another psychologist, that I might have OCD. And so I was motivated to get into therapy. And then once I was there, I saw it work with the text messages.
Gotcha.
And that motivated, you know, in some way, I'm very lucky that I had that disconfirmation almost immediately. But I think that was in part, you know, by design. I was doing something that I was going to get, that wasn't easy for me by any means, but it wasn't the most difficult of my ERP. So it was a kind of I hate to say this, it was kind of like baby steps into it. The reason I hate to say that is because if you've seen What About Bob, the therapist is an OCD therapist who writes a book called Baby Steps. But it was kind of baby steps into it. I got to see it working over the smaller things, and I got the confirmation that this could work with the bigger things, and that I could really change the way that my life works. But I don't think that I had this obsessive compulsive kind of fear of failing, and then Tina would find out that I was a failure, and then I don't know, I guess she would tell my friends. And my life would be over. That wasn't really present, and I can't, maybe Tina could speak to it. Wasn't really there.
Yeah, so another way that we've talked about this, Samantha, is about impression management, because a lot of the compulsions around this were around sort of like impression management, again, leading to the core fear of, I'm going to ruin my life. And we would check in about that every we started, even if somebody doesn't like fully articulate exactly what their intrusive image is about. If I know that we're checking the POCD box and all of these other boxes, like the cat's out of the bag, the impression management's kind of useless at that point. So I do think that makes it a little bit easier. Chris, would you agree?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. That, you know, literally, the psychologist I talked to, or the psychiatrist who said you have OCD, I told them I had intrusive thoughts about harming children. And I think that's the easier way for me to say it. Tina was literally the first human being I ever told that I had intrusive thoughts about sexually abusing children. And once you tell me that, you know, like, the impression management is completely out the window. Point.
Yeah. And Chris, just to wrap up with one or more question, this one or two extra questions, Lauren, who wasn't able to come off mic, had asked her question in the chat about privacy, and if there has been anyone else, like support groups or other people with OCD, if you haven't shared the content of some of your obsessions with family and your wife, is there anybody other than me?
So I have had support, but the Tina's Practice actually organizes a support group, which I attended, and it's virtual, which is really nice. But it's great because I haven't done it in a while, I'll be honest, but it was really refreshing to sit around with a bunch of people and just openly talk about these things, and knowing that those people know what OCD is.
Mhm.
I, as we kind of said before, the same reason I don't tell my wife is that, I would be hesitant to mention that to anybody unless they truly understood what OCD was. And that's okay. I don't need to be telling everybody about it. But it does help to know that there are support groups that I can go and discuss it if I need to.
Absolutely. And the other thing I want to just add to that for the group is to think about like that OCD is not actually about the content of what somebody is obsessed about. It's about this glitchy process that happens between obsessions and compulsions and getting really stuck in that loop. And the most important thing to share, if you need to share something about what's going on deeper, is about the process and not necessarily the content, because A, Chris's family members, like many of our clients' family members, are not trained mental health professionals. And B, what his obsessions are about are going to be focused on the things that are most important to him and his values. And that coincides with his wife's values too. So while Chris's daughter is one of the most important, if not the most important thing in his life, that's probably true for his wife too. And so she's going to hear him having obsessions about their daughter very differently than a mental health professional, and right, our expectation that she could understand that from a clinical perspective without that clinical training is unfair to her and unfair to him. So there's more to be done from a professional standpoint about like much better education in the public about what OCD is and what OCD thoughts look like, as opposed to the other kinds of problems that could sound similar but are very different. But that onus is not on our patients to do that.
I just want to add, my mother, who is in her late 70s and is a nurse who got her nursing degree in I guess the 60s, did not believe that I had OCD until I did this. When did I last do this talk? In October?
December?
December. So
Yeah.
she just didn't believe it, and I didn't really try and go into it, but I tried to explain what it was, and she just was like, you're fine, you don't have that, and it wasn't until I did this and told her that I was doing this and how many people I spoke to and what I talked about that she finally believed that I have something that she doesn't understand, essentially, that I have OCD. So she just, she's my mother and I have a wonderful relationship with her, but she just, kind of doesn't understand it, so refused to believe it.
I know we have a lot of hands up and we have so many people, I'm sure we could spend another hour answering questions. I want to be respectful of Chris's time. Do you want to take one more question? We're past 3 o'clock.
Yeah, I don't have anything till 3:30. Not that I want to sit here for 30 minutes, but and not that I don't either. But yeah, that's perfectly fine. I can take a couple more.
Yeah, I think let's just take one more and then we're all going to be really grateful for your extra time. Masha, I think you're going to be the last question for us.
Hey, thanks, Chris. I just was wondering about what was your Super Bowl exposure?
Oh, I have to, let me look here.
Have your hierarchy in front of you?
I do, just because I wanted to refresh my memory. My Super Bowl was, so I had to spend a lot of time on Google looking at online shopping for like kindergartner age bathing suits. And that was incredibly difficult to do. I'll say this, it's incredibly difficult for, I kind of touched on this before, because there is this natural, there's several things going on, but there's this natural repulsion to certain things, and then there's this, this OCD part of me. So it was hard to kind of delineate that. I think that kind of took longer to de-stress or to you know, to not be stressed out about it, because I mean, if you just Google, you know, 5-year-old bathing suit, there's a lot of stuff on the internet that shouldn't be on the internet. I'm not talking about, you know, porn or anything like that. It's just there's a lot of stuff out there that would make anybody uncomfortable looking at, or most people uncomfortable looking at. So I had to look at those photos over and over again, and basically what we concluded, or what kind of Tina's way of making me eventually comfortable with it, is that, you know, to harm a child like that is a preference that somebody has. It's something that they legitimately want to do. They're not repulsed by it and then do it. And so understanding that and looking at those photos was very helpful to kind of get to the end of that.
Hard and powerful. Yeah, for sure. Chris, I just want to thank you again so much for your time. I know that it's incredibly valuable for everyone in this training. And I want to thank everyone for your really thoughtful questions. It's great to see you.
Next week, I think.
Yes, and I'll let you go. So we really appreciate your time with this. With us.
Yeah, thank you so much to everybody for having me and for helping the people that you help. And hopefully you can take something away from this that helps somebody else that's been struggling for 18 years. So have a good one. Thank you so much.
I hope you get to read the chat and see how much we all appreciated this.
I will. I'm sure Tina will email it to me.
Yes. What I like to do with just this section of the chat is download it and send it to Chris or any of our guest speakers, because it's really well deserved, and you're very appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye. Okay, so we're gonna shift back. I probably want to take our break at around closer to 3:30 Eastern. I know that there were a couple of questions. Let's just focus for a few more minutes on some of those questions before we launch back into imaginal exposure. Because I know that Chris went through a lot. I'm sure that there's a lot of other ways of integrating the information that he talked about that we could pause on. So Amanda, go ahead.
Thanks. So at one point he was talking about, like, now that he's doing the booster sessions with you, he's trying to think more like a normal person, is how he put it. And so I'm wondering, like, how you do that in session without are you providing reassurance? Like, yes, I'm guessing you don't, but are you like, yeah, that is how normal, like, I don't like the word normal, but that's kind of like the words he used. But like, how are you navigating that when he wants to think like a normal person?
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that he wants to think like a normal person. I would say that he wants to be able to not get stuck with intrusive thoughts in the way that a person without OCD does not get stuck with intrusive thoughts. So I don't know if we've gotten to this information yet, but they did some, if any of you are familiar with the name Jack Rackman, there are some old school researchers back in the late 80s that did these research studies where they looked at samples of people who have OCD and samples of people who do not have OCD across the globe. And what they found is that in people who do not have OCD, 90% of those people still reported having intrusive thoughts. And the premise in, like, the professional field is, like, the other 10% who said that they didn't were just not being honest. So what we know is that it is typical of the human brain to have intrusive thoughts, okay? It is typical of the human brain. It is different between people who have OCD versus don't have OCD in the way that they get stuck and perseverative and obsessed and trapped with those intrusive thoughts versus someone who does not have OCD is able to sort of like recognize that thought, recognize it as sort of ridiculous and let it go in one ear and out the other. And that That's language that I know Chris and I have shared. That's, I think, what he means when he says that. And so what we will do in our booster sessions at this point, my job as a good cognitive behavioral therapist and an ERP therapist is not to be the source of the solution to his problems, but to train him to be his own ERP therapist. That's how you know you're doing this well, is that you are training your patients to be their own ERP therapist. So at this point, like, we don't have a hierarchy that I have created for him. He knows when it's time to do an exposure. He knows what his compulsions are and how to use his skills to resist. Where we check in are like, hey, for some reason, this has been a stressful week. I'm not sure why it is, but I'm getting really stuck with these kinds of obsessions. And I'm not sure if the right way to do an exposure to them is this, or like, I can't tell if this is a compulsion or if this is just a reasonable behavior. So I'm almost like a balance point or a checkpoint to say, like, that does sound like an obsession. Let's run it through the definition of an obsession. Or to say, not everything that someone with OCD thinks about is a symptom. Sometimes people who have OCD are just stressed about things, and they're stressed in a very understandable, like, typical way, not in an obsessive way. And so, like, I'm just another sounding board to be able to work through some of these triggers and symptoms that come up, and like help problem solve how to get past them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. That provides some clarity. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. Joanna.
Hi, I just had a question as far as the intake, and kind of using Chris as an example with the severity of his OCD. At what point do you also talk about medication management in conjunction with therapy?
Yeah, so I really prefer, based on our clinical practice guidelines, I'm a psychologist, so I follow the clinical practice guidelines laid out by APA. And I really prefer a shared decision-making discussion about what are the frontline interventions. So when I do an intake evaluation, I am giving somebody that feedback, and I'm saying, based on the outcomes of my evaluation, and here's the measures that I used in this evaluation. These are the gold standard methods for evaluating these different kinds of conditions. I think that what's going on for you is really best described by obsessive compulsive disorder. And here are the available options for treating obsessive compulsive disorder. The frontline treatment, like our standard clinical best practice, is exposure and response prevention. For people who are not, I'll describe a little bit of what that is. For people who that's not available or that's not their preference, here's the second line intervention. The second line intervention for OCD is SSRI medication or clomipramine, or that plus exposure and response prevention. For people who are not interested in any of those things, then I might be talking about some, like, outside of our clinical practice guidelines, here are other options that have some supporting evidence but are not yet empirically supported treatments, like TMS or ketamine or inference-based CBT or things like that. So, like, I will lay all that out for people. For someone like Chris, he'd already seen a psychiatrist. He sees a psychiatric nurse practitioner. And so he had someone that could have prescribed him clomipramine or SSRIs long before he came to see me. He came to see me as a non-prescribing ERP provider because he already knew he didn't want to be on medication. So he wanted to be able to do this without medication. And just because his severity score his YBOC severity score was severe, was not a reason for me to say, you must do this with medication. It's not even worth trying it without medication. That's not consistent with what we know from the research that we presented to you all on day one. But what I will say is, and I'm not saying this at the beginning because I don't necessarily anticipate it's going to go poorly, but if we got to session 10, session 8, session 10, session 12, something around that, and there was really little gain, that might be when I would be considering, well, like, let's look at the severity of scores. Let's look at what else might help take the edge off of this anxiety so that we can be more effective in this treatment. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Okay, Catherine, I've got you up next.
Hi, thank you. Quick question. Have you come across clients that you know, using Chris as an example, like his obsessions are kind of a very sensitive nature, and I'm sure it's hard for him to disclose. And then in this day and age where a lot of therapy is virtual, do you have you seen any pushback from clients of having almost like a fear or paranoia of wanting to do this kind of treatment virtually as opposed to in person? And how do you kind of handle that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't know. I don't think I heard Chris mention this, but he and I have never met in person. Our entire course of treatment, including our intake evaluation, has only been virtual. And we live in the same city. Like, he could come to my office, but because of his work schedule and his preference, like, our care has always been virtual. And so I just use that as an example to say, it's very possible to have a full course of treatment that is still highly successful, never meeting someone in person. And Catherine, I don't personally find that there is a phenomenon where because categorically people's obsessions can be sensitive in nature, they're less inclined to virtual treatment. That can happen. There are some people that we've seen along the way who might be concerned about, like, people hacking into their computer or being able to record what they're saying virtually or something like that. At our practice, if that is an issue for someone, then we can offer to see them in person. But I do more virtual days than I do in-person days. And so there's a tremendous amount of people that we've seen over the years who it's been perfectly fine virtually.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is it Taney?
Connie.
Connie, hi.
I just have a question about intermittent reinforcement. So we talked about it earlier, like our goal is 100% compliance. Can you talk about that? Why there's probably not a fear of that, or?
Are you talking about intermittent reinforcement with resisting compulsions, or with performing compulsions, or with doing exposures?
Either one. Like, I just imagine, I know I've been trained in other forms of exposure, and we want to make sure they're not, some days doing the compulsion, some days not. And it sounded like we're okay as long as they're getting closer and closer to 100% with this.
Yeah. So we're always in the beginning from day one saying pie in the sky, we're aiming at 100% ritual prevention, because you're right. Anytime that you let a ritual or a compulsion slip through, it is inadvertently reinforcing the whole system. That being said, we are often getting successive approximations that are sort of moving people closer and closer to more comprehensive ritual prevention. So I'm not worried about that along the way. What I do tend to focus on in the beginning is I'm always going to say that once we start exposures, we are also simultaneously starting response prevention. And I want them to try to make an effort to resisting compulsions across the board. And the ones that are most important, even though they're all important, the ones that are most important are the ones that correspond with the exposures that we're doing at this moment. So like the example that Chris did, we started off with sending text messages. And actually, just so that you guys can think about how you set up and frame an exposure where the stimulus might happen very quickly, like sending a text message takes 2 seconds. What we did is for 20 to 30 minutes, sit there and send more text messages and responded to text messages or send text messages to other people. So there was, like multiple practices in one exposure session. So what I'm going to say for him is, starting from now, we're talking about response prevention across the board. I want you aiming for 100%, but like the ones that are your hill to die on this week are like not rewriting, respelling, apologizing for a spelling error and trying to fix it that way, that sort of thing. Yeah, right. I have you up next.
Thank you. I've been really, or it's made a big impression on me, the concept of front loading so much education and getting buy-in early on in the process, and the way in which that, shapes how somebody approaches when the beginning, the early stages of exposure. My question is sort of twofold. One is, is there a correlation between the amount of front loading of education and orientation and dropout rates? So in other words, do dropout rates decrease the more that you do the preparation and the preparation going into the exposure phase?
So no one to my knowledge has looked at that like in a controlled research trial where they've said like normally we have 2 pre-treatment sessions, or like we have ERP session number 1, which is rationale, and ERP session number 2, which is hierarchy development, and then we start exposures on session 3. Like I don't know of any clinical trials where they've said instead of 2, let's do 5 or let's do 4 and just see if one is better or one is worse in terms of dropout rates. I will say in my personal experience, more sessions is worse. So like the longer it takes before you actually break the ice and start exposures, the harder it is to get to exposures, the longer you're holding off on the thing that's actually going to start making change for someone. And the easier it is to get into this sort of like purgatory of, right, like the avoidance starts to creep up, is what I mean. I typically stay pretty by the book in the way that I'm structuring our sessions. Like I'm never usually spending more than those 2, or if I only have 60 minutes with someone, like 1, 2, and 3 treatment planning sessions before exposure starts. Every once in a while, I really shy away from doing this because every time I do it, I regret it. But every once in a while, I will agree to do bi-weekly treatment with someone, like only twice a month. And it bites me every time because it's so diffuse that now it's like 4 weeks or 6 weeks before we started exposure. And always those are the cases where I see dropout the most. So that doesn't mean that we've had more treatment sessions, but this time, it just really allows avoidance to creep its way in.
Okay.
Does that help?
That helps a lot, actually. Thanks. Good
Yeah.
perspective. Appreciate that.
Yeah, sure. Michelle.
Hi, first, that last question was great. I definitely have a few clients where I feel like I'm in purgatory a little bit, or like just a lot of avoidance is happening. So I do want to dive, that wasn't going to be my question. I just wanted to comment on that, but that was very interesting to hear from your perspective. But the other question I had was like more so with family involvement. For Chris's example, saying that like his wife doesn't know the specifics, and he kind of started out saying this was a big secret, right? And then kind of looking at how this is still a secret from most of like everyone he knows in his personal life. And I was just curious, like, is that kind of perpetuating like shame in a way to continue? And it's like, couldn't like an ultimate exposure be to tell his wife, but no reassurance, and that would probably be scary. But I'm just curious with like how much shame kind of comes in and how this could be more like isolating potentially. I understand she doesn't understand maybe OCD the way we would understand it, but just curious like your perspective on it and like how to navigate that. Because I have a couple of clients where family does want to be involved, but it can get messy sometimes.
Yeah, there's I could talk about this for a very long time, but I want to sort of, there's 2 bullet points that I really want to hit on here. One is that whether or not that could be an exposure always comes back to me and whether or not this is a reasonable risk. So like there are some people that you disclose certain things to, it doesn't even have to do anything with their OCD, and it is not a reasonable risk to take that this person will respond well. Right. And when we conduct exposures, we are basically conducting experiments, hoping to disconfirm somebody's fear. And so if this was a family member that I did not think responded well to other mental health information or was prone to be very triggered by this, I would not think that would be a good exposure because it might not be a reasonable risk. It might be a high risk situation of going wrong, right? Okay. The other thing is for some family members where it is important both for the patient. For Chris, he doesn't care if his wife knows about the content. So like it's not consistent with his values. It's not something that he's obsessed about. I don't need to do an exposure around it. But for some some patients, they really want to be understood in that way. There are really great, very specific resources that we can use. I find having like a brochure or a pamphlet about this thing or something that's on a website can be really helpful to just concretize the information for family members. Like, this is not just, you know, my spouse or my kid or whatever it is trying to explain to me that this is my problem. Like, this is laid out in a pamphlet. Like, this is a known thing that people struggle with and experience, and especially some of the things from the International OCD Foundation can really help frame that that conversation. So I would use tools. I've also many times invited family members to come to sessions so that I can be part of the conversation, explaining about somebody's OCD and trying to help family members have a better understanding of what that means. Because I do think overall, one of the reasons why it takes people 14 to 17 years on average to get accurately diagnosed with OCD is because it is so poorly understood in the community and even among mental health providers. People often think that, like, I don't often trust that that it is like a low risk situation to disclose about some of these things, because I had so many patients by the time they come to me say, you know, this psychiatrist told me that I was psychotic, or this other mental health provider, thought I was going to murder my boyfriend, or like whatever it is. Those stories time and time again. If I can't trust that other mental health providers out there are going to know it's OCD, why would I trust this person who, works in finance?
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. It makes sense too to look at it like he wasn't obsessed about that. That wasn't part of his value system. And so why worry about it if that wasn't a focus? Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. And the last thing I'll say to that is that might have been the case that I was the first person that he told about some of the most sensitive parts of his OCD. But at this point, this is the second workshop. We have other patient guest speakers who we invite as well, because we have a lot of people who want to share their story, which is wonderful. So like now he's told like 600 mental health providers and also like a fair amount of people in our local community by coming to our support groups, and right, like it's not a secret.
Yeah, no, he's getting that exposure. Dude, no, for sure.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, Eric, I'm going to take your question, and then I think it's going to be time for a break. So for those of you who have your hands up, who I'm not going to get to, write your questions down, and we'll see if we'll be able to come back to them later. Okay, Eric.
Awesome, thank you. And I was thinking that's also like trauma. You just somebody needs to know you have trauma, not what your trauma is.
Exactly.
That's how I was thinking about it. I have I've been looking ahead, and I have a structural question, because how do you know it's over? Because in PE, the PCL score goes down, the studs go down, and then the client kind of looks at you and like, I'm done with this. But I don't see, so is it kind of a little bit of client self-report? Are you doing Y-box every once in a while? Are you checking to see if like the main fears, if stress is going down, but is it a little bit more like artistic, like a feel and not so much a number?
Great question. There's a bunch of things that will tell you we're getting close to the end and it's time to stop. So one is that you have a hierarchy that has 10 to 15 items, not 20 to 30 items, and not 5 items. So like 10 to 15 items is the sweet spot, because what we know is that ERP is evidence-based for 17 to 25 sessions. There is actual data to suggest that more than 25 sessions is a plateau. Like, you're not going to get much better with more of the same. Okay. So I'm thinking, how many sessions that we had? How far up the hierarchy are we? So in 17 to 25 sessions, I'm trying to get through 10 to 15 in vivo exposures, maybe a couple of channels, right? Along the way, best case scenario, I want to do like a midpoint Y-box severity score. I don't have to go through the whole checklist, but I want to get an updated 10 questions. And best case scenario, I have a friend in my clinic who's not me, with my biased interpretation of how this treatment is going, that I can say like, hey, could you see my patient for 15 minutes and just get an updated severity score for me? That's best case scenario, right? But like I'll do that myself if I don't have somebody else who can do that for me. So I'm getting a little bit of objective data as well. There is also a self-report version of the Y box, so you could use that also. We're not doing weekly scores in the same way that we might be doing in PE with weekly PCL5s, but I would do like a, hey, I'm around like session 9, session 10, like this is a good time to check in about scores. I also, along the way, as we're climbing the hierarchy, when I'm checking in with people about their ritual prevention and response prevention, I'm asking them to give me an estimate of how well they think it's going. So when I ask those questions at the beginning of session, every session, I am starting out the session with a quick mood check. And then I'm saying, let's look at your homework and let me ask about ritual prevention. And I'll ask those last 2 questions of the Y box severity score. So I'll say like, of all the compulsive urges you had in the past week, what % of the time do you think you were making an effort to resist? And then what % of the time were you successful? And I'm tracking those estimates along the way. So like by session like 16, 17, 18, I'm hoping to see we're basically at the top of this person's hierarchy. Their subjective report of their anxiety and distress is going down. Their mastery over their OCD is well improved. I've gotten like a midway Y box severity score. Their rates of ritual prevention are really high, like close to 100%. And I'm starting to have a really candid conversation with my patients about graduation and when it's going to be time, like how much more, what's left to really work on. Does that help?
Okay. No, that definitely helps me conceptualize it without the numbers that you get in like PE and stuff like that. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. All right, everyone. I'm going to say it's time for our 10-minute break. So I have that it's 3:32 Eastern. We're going to take 10 minutes. We'll come back at 3:42, and then we're going to go back and do a little bit more conversation about imaginal exposure. So I'll see you all in 10 minutes. Oh, that went fast. All right, everyone. We're getting back in the saddle. We had our lightning speed 10-minute break. I hope everybody's ready to go. Thank you for those of you who are turning on your cameras so that I know you're back. What I want to do, because I have a bit of a longer video that I want to be able to show you about imaginal exposure, is get back to our content about imaginal exposure. Those of you who have your hands up still from Chris coming to talk with us, or just generally about the training, make sure to write your questions down. And we will be circling back around to questions as frequently as we can. We're going to be going until 5 o'clock. That was our last break. So I am going to get into our content, and hold on just a minute. Okay, so we have talked a bit about scripted imaginal exposure, and typically when you are doing an imaginal exposure, especially if this is your first go around with ERP, you are going to be starting with imaginal exposure scripts. We want to also teach you that there is another way of conducting imaginal exposure that is more of an unscripted stream of consciousness kind of version. So I want to reiterate, and I'm going to get my laser pointer up, that it is typical and recommended to start out with an imaginal exposure script. There's a couple reasons for that. One is that you really have a lot more control over what the imaginal exposure narrative is. You have the ability, before you start doing the exposure, to make sure it's detailed enough, to make sure it's long enough, to make sure that it is really making this if then repetitive comparison between, all because I didn't do my compulsions, this is why my worst fears were realized. All because I didn't do my compulsions, this is why my worst fears were realized. If you go back to the written script example that we shared with you, you'll see that reiterated at the beginning, reiterated at the end. And so I would recommend starting out with script writing when you're getting your feet under yourself, practicing imaginal exposure. We want to teach you about unscripted imaginal exposure for a couple of different reasons. One is that this is an acceptable, alternative, equally valid way to do imaginal exposure. Some of you may have done unscripted imaginal exposure in other exposure therapies. This is more of a stream of consciousness, kind of letting your imagination run wild, unscripted way of doing imaginal exposure. A couple of the benefits include that the script doesn't stay exactly the same every single time. So when you're scripting an imaginal exposure, you are reiterating exactly what you have written every time, and that will be the only version of this exposure that someone would practice for homework. They would essentially be repeating that script maybe 30 times or more as they practice a couple iterations of it every day between 1 week to the next. When you have unscripted imaginal exposure, you can kind of, using that downward arrow method, allow people's imaginations to run wild, which means that in a given 20-minute imaginal exposure session, they might get through 3 iterations or 4 iterations of a narrative of this frame story, but the details might be a little bit different. And so it might allow them to explore different kinds of consequences. Just because we saw Chris and he was talking about how most of his OCD roads lead to, and then I'm homeless and penniless, that might mean that if we were doing an imaginal exposure about how, if he didn't do all of his counting compulsions and bodily clenching and XYZ, when it was time to go and, take his daughter to dance class or something like that, all because he didn't do those compulsions, he might lose control and, pick up a child inappropriately or grab a child inappropriately and so on and so forth. And it would all lead to his life being ruined and him being homeless and penniless and so on and so forth. In an unscripted imaginal exposure, we would stick with that frame story, but it might take different roads to get to the end. And so you just allow for a bigger variety of details to be explored. Unscripted imaginal exposure might also allow OCD's imagination to go even further beyond interfered consequences. Now, in the script that we shared with you, we really take this to the nth degree. In that script about how this guy poops his pants, kids see and make fun of him, adults see and make fun of him, the police come, he becomes a sex offender, his spouse hates him, his best friends hates him, he's penniless and alone, right? Like, we really go to the nth degree of ridiculousness. So you can see how that you can do that in a scripted imaginal exposure. In an unscripted imaginal exposure, you get the possibility of, in the moment, in your imagination, seeing how far that imagination can go. And sometimes it can go even further than that. Developing imagery in real time also can help enhance emotional activation and emotional engagement with the exposure story. Now, certainly people can be very appropriately emotionally engaged doing a scripted imaginal exposure, but for some people, writing and then reading is so much more of a cognitive exercise. The unscripted version, where they don't get into the nitty gritty of like actually framing out a story, can just help them facilitate this emotional engagement. It overcomes any kind of potential limitations in emotional activation with listening or reading. So that's sort of the benefits and reasons for unscripted imaginal exposure. I want to get into the instructions of what you would do. So in order to do this, we would start with a framework of, all because I didn't do these compulsions, these are why my feared outcomes happened. So we've given you a couple of examples of this, right? Like, all because I didn't check the stove after cooking dinner, this is, lo and behold, the house burned to the ground. Or all because I didn't count in my head over and over and over again, I lost control and my worst fear happened at my daughter's dance class. Or all because I didn't scan and check my bodily sensations before I went out on a run, I, in fact, did poop my pants and my life was ruined. So you want to have, just like you would for scripted exposure, in unscripted exposure, you'd want to at least know the, all because I didn't do this, this horrible, horrible thing happened. And similar to written imaginal exposure, what we would also want to make sure here is that we're doing imaginal exposure for a good reason. So these would be feared consequences that would be impossible or unsafe and inappropriate to confront and explore in an in vivo way. We also want to start with a common triggering situation. So it's not just that these are the obsessions that I might have, or these are the fears that I have, but in a common triggering situation. So I want to reference the triggering situations. The trigger is cooking dinner. The trigger is going and being around a bunch of 5-year-old girls at dance class in tights. The trigger is going for a run, right? We want to have a common triggering situation that might have come up on this person's symptom monitoring when they're doing their ritual self-monitoring for homework, or that we know from their Y box, whatever a typical triggering situation might be. And we really want to consider triggering situations that are difficult to resist compulsions in. So exploring fears, I want to bring you way back to day one, where we talked about how exposure is the part of the treatment that is going to ultimately reduce anxiety. Exposure is the treatment for reducing anxiety, whereas response prevention and ritual prevention is the treatment for eliminating rituals. When somebody is having a hard time cutting back on their rituals and eliminating rituals, the exposure that's going to wear out the intensity of the anxiety that is making it hard for them to stop doing rituals, it's what's going to facilitate that. They work hand in hand. So if you have someone who is really having a hard time resisting certain kinds of compulsions, and you can't confront their fears and reduce that anxiety in an in vivo way, that would be a great time to whip out this imaginal exposure, because they're struggling with this ritual prevention. So having that sort of facilitative relationship between the two. The details are going to be a little bit different. So when you're writing an imaginal exposure script, as I said to you before, you're really doing two different things in your session. The script writing piece of the session is different than the exposure piece of the session. The exposure piece of the session is once you're saying, hey, we're going to do this for a set period of time. We're going to try to be welcoming and willing to experience that distress. I'm going to try to have you visualize this in your mind's eye. We're going to, you know, have an audio recording of this. Like the exposure portion of this in and of itself is kind of circumscribed when you're reading through an imaginal exposure script. When you're doing this in a free form stream of consciousness, unscripted way, there are some details that you're going to have to set up for your clients so that they know the process. And so we're going to start, as you give your instructions, by having you close your eyes, and we're going to talk through what happens in this triggering situation when you don't do your compulsions. I'm going to say that again. I'm going to have you close your eyes, and we're going to talk through what happens in this triggering situation when you don't do your compulsions in the present tense, as though it's happening right now. We're going to try to include lots of sensory details, what you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you're touching, what you're feeling. We're also going to include internal thoughts and feelings, what's going through your mind, what's the emotion in the moment that you're going through this narrative. And you might even need to model this process or do a little demo for your patients so that they understand, because this is a contrived therapy method. This isn't the way that we tell stories. This isn't the way that we talk about our fears. And so you might have to model what this looks like. You will also have to probe and guide along the way. So while this person has their eyes closed and they're trying to imagine what would happen in this triggering situation when they don't do their compulsions, you as the therapist are mostly going to be quiet, and strategically, to keep the story moving forward, you're going to ask them those downward arrow probing techniques, because this is a made up story. This hasn't happened yet. So you're asking them, you know, if that were to happen, what are you most afraid would happen next? Or if that happens, what's the worst part about that in the moment? What's the worst thing you're afraid will happen after that? What happens next? And just periodically interjecting with some summary statements. Also, the benefit of doing an unscripted imaginal exposure is that you don't have to spend the time in your session writing a script. So if you decide that it's time to do an imaginal exposure because this set of compulsions is really difficult, or there's another reason, in the video that I'll show you, I'm going to give an example that hopefully articulates why we're choosing to do imaginal exposure for this person's symptoms. So you don't have all of that prep work. You can just get right down to business with the exposure in your session. You want to make sure that you're going to be audio recording that exposure so that they have that captured for homework. Now, as the therapist, I'm never the one doing the recording, whether we're virtual or in person, right? This is patient content. And so I'm asking them to make recordings for themselves. They're either recording on their phone, or we're having a preparatory conversation about how they're going to bring like an MP3 recorder or their iPad or something like that to our next session so they can make their own recording, because that's material that I want them to have and to be responsible. It's not material I'm going to send over the internet. It's not material that I'm going to save in their medical record or I'm going to hold on my personal computer, anything like that. So they're going to be making an audio recording for themselves for the purpose of homework. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and I want to share with you a training video that we made. This is actually, I'm the therapist, and this is one of our graduate students who is representing a patient that she is actively seeing. So this is a training video and not an actual patient video. But what I want to be able to show you, I'm going to skip around in this video a little bit because I don't want to show you the entire thing. I'm going to show you the setup, a little bit of the rationale for imaginal exposure in an unscripted way, and also why we might choose to do imaginal exposure for particular content. And then we're going to see at least the first iteration of her imaginal exposure story as we explore it. So let me get to our video. And again, I'm going to turn my camera off just so I can make sure we're streaming really high quality bandwidth. I want you guys that have your cameras on to just give me a thumbs up that as I play this, the audio is sounding good and the video is not lagging. And we've talked about all the ways that you're doing this in vivo, in real time, to really break OCD's rules and take the risk that by selling these clothes that have dyes that you know are in them that are potentially poisonous, you might be like really taking out a whole population of people. So I just want to pause there and interject that the symptom pairing that we are working on, you'll hear this reiterated, but I just want to make it really clear. This person is having harm-related obsessions. She's a person who works in a retail store selling clothing that is pretty ubiquitous, like a nationwide retail store. And her obsessions are that there may be dyes and other content of the clothing that is being sold in her retail store that are toxic and poisonous, and that if she doesn't prevent people from buying them or warn people about them, then people are going to die. They're going to get poisoned and they're going to die. Now, we know this is a pretty rational fear because we know this is a national retail store and like millions of people are wearing these sweaters, even if there is a shade of truth that probably the dye in them does have some like toxic content. It's clearly not like mass murdering people, right? So I just want you to have that framework. We're going to start talking about how this is something that she can do in an in vivo exposure way. And if we can do something in an in vivo exposure way, we always want to start there. So that's what you're about to hear. And then we're also going to talk about why we might also do imaginal exposure around these fears. So from an in vivo standpoint, I'm really pleased with where you've gone with this, with a lot of the sharing advertisements. So like lots of sharing advertisements for this clothing store on Facebook, on Instagram, like really encouraging people to buy them. You've been doing a really great job with resisting rituals to confess to people about the dyes that are in the clothes, to protect people from touching them, to spray them down at the beginning of your shift. But I really, it struck me what you were saying about still having a lot of intrusive images. So I want you to say that again about what's happening, intrusive fears that are still coming up when you're at work.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's just, I can't seem to shake this image that, you know, even if I do everything right, even if I, you know, warn people or try not to warn people, you know, as we've been practicing, as they're checking out, that they'll walk out of there and, you know, our new like fall collection of clothes is in now. And so there's really dark colors, like a lot of dye in the clothes. And I just have this image of like someone wearing one of our fall sweaters and like the dye just really like getting all over their skin and their arms and like soaking into the blood and just like choking and dying, like dropping to the floor.
So I just want to say again that I think given that you're still having a lot of those images and they're obviously, like I can even see on your face, they're causing you that spike of anxiety and distress when they come up, you're doing an amazing job of pushing the clothes on people instead of encouraging them to avoid. And I know that that's really hard. I know in the past we've talked about imaginal exposure when we were making our hierarchy and generally talking about the kinds of exposures that we might do. Most of the time, anything that we can do in a real-time in vivo way, bringing lots of those sweaters to the dressing room to say, hey, try these on too, like that kind of stuff is always going to be really powerful. But given what you've been telling me about how this week has been going while you're doing those in vivo exposures, and this idea and imagery of people just dying from this clothing, I think it might be a good day for us to focus on an imaginal exposure. And I'm curious about what you remember about the idea of imaginal exposure and why we might do that.
Yeah, I remember we talked about that as kind of like almost like thinking about the very worst case scenario, right? Like usually in the store, people don't actually drop dead. So we can't practice what that's like and kind of yeah, I remember talking about imaginals being like playing out the worst case that could happen, that OCD is telling me could happen.
Yeah, for sure. The other reason why we do imaginal exposure is so that we can essentially face our fears that are unsafe to face in real life. Now, you and I have already gotten to the place where we know it's safe to allow people to try on these sweaters and clothes and things like that, even though OCD is constantly yelling at you that it's potentially really dangerous. But what's something that we can't replicate in real life is actually taking people down, right? Like we can't cause people to choke and die and purposefully be poisoned and just get you used to that idea. No, nor would we want to. But one of the things that may help, because it sounds to me like these images are really chasing you. And a lot of the time during the day, you're trying to dodge them and resist them and turn your attention away, but it's really hard. They're chasing you down. And something that can help when we do imaginal exposure is that we are intentionally going to bring those images on. So like you said, we're going to imagine those images on purpose and imagine the worst case scenario pieces of those images. Just like any of the other exposures that we have been doing, we're going to do that for an extended period of time, and we're going to do it over and over and over and over again, which can be like, why would I want to imagine these horrible things? Why do you think that might be helpful? From what you already know about exposure, why might that be a useful therapeutic tool?
I think, yeah, from my practice actually doing things, in real life in the store, the more times I've done it, the easier it becomes. And every time, my anxiety just comes down a little bit. And so I guess that would be the point.
Yeah, for sure. And you're talking about habituation, and that is definitely one of the reasons why we do imaginal exposure. That when we intentionally evoke these images instead of dodging them and running from them constantly, we do get the experience of learning that the distress that they provoke and the anxiety that they cause doesn't last forever. And when we do it repeatedly, that anxiety ultimately wears itself down faster and faster. So then even when those images come up, they're not nearly as provocative and anxiety provoking. And so it sort of like wears down the intensity of the image. And that's really important because that's what's getting at you right now. Am I right about that?
Yeah, totally. Like it's hard to kind of focus once those images come up, and I just get in this spiral around that and I lose my train of thought, and it's really disruptive.
Yeah. Okay. So the other thing that I think is really important learning from doing imaginal exposure and intentionally evoking these images and playing out the worst case stories, as you said before, is that you get to learn some stuff about yourself. Like right now, again, you're kind of dodging these images just to get through your day. You're trying to resist them by redirecting your attention and just distracting yourself. But there is something really powerful about turning around and facing them head on instead of running from them. And one of the things that allows you to do when you face these images head on is that you learn that you can. So you learn that these images are just images. They're just like any other obsession. They're just intrusive, unwelcome, garbage thoughts. And you also learn, along with that habituation and feeling like the intensity of the anxiety goes down, the more you turn around and face these images, that you can handle what's in your mind. And that's a really big deal, because I'm hearing from you that right now it almost feels unmanageable.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's like people choking and dying, and it's my fault. So
yeah. The other thing that imaginal exposure can be really, really helpful in teaching us is that saying these things out loud, thinking these images on purpose, and even saying the words out loud, like I'm responsible for killing people, or all because I didn't hold back this sweater from this woman, she's now dead and it's all my fault. Sometimes people believe that if saying these things out loud makes it more likely that they're going to happen, or more likely that they're going to accidentally bring on these worst case consequences. I'm curious how much you identify with that.
I guess it's like I just feel kind of guilty. Like the more that these images come into my head, it's like the more I'm thinking that that would be my fault, and the more that I'm thinking like, well, I should have just sprayed it down that morning. Like I should have done whatever I could do to prevent that.
Yeah. So I think if you're willing, being able to go through some of these scenarios in an imaginal way may be able to teach you, and I expect that it will be able to teach you that thinking through this and talking through these consequences doesn't make it more likely that they're going to happen, and doesn't make you more culpable or guilty. It's almost like that magical leap of superstition or karma or whatever you might say. That thinking about people dying is almost like wanting people to die or something like that. The other piece of this that we've talked a little bit about is that inherently there's some uncertainty with it. Like you might see someone hit the deck the moment they put the sweater on, but it might be a while, right? They might go home with that sweater or that piece of clothing, and you might not know for days or weeks whether or not they've been poisoned by the dyes and all of these things. And so one of the things imaginal exposure can help us do is by facing these fears in your mind's eye, you learn how to build up a tolerance for that uncertainty as well. Can you see that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I know, yeah, like we talked about how right now, a lot of the times I want to be looking in the newspaper and checking obituaries to make sure nobody died after I sold them the sweater. And uncertainty is really hard, Dina.
Yeah, uncertainty is definitely really hard. And I just want to reiterate, you're already doing a really great job of facing these fears while you're at work in real time, despite the images that are popping into your head, despite the anxiety that's happening. And you said yourself, like there is some habituation occurring there. It's not like it's this static, really intense experience. I do think though, having some imaginal exposure to wear out the intensity of those images themselves and feel like you have more of a handle on them is going to make you feel even more confident and competent to do those in vivo exposures too. They're going to kind of work in tandem. Okay, I am going to pause it here and we're going to skip ahead to see the start of her imaginal exposure.
Yeah, okay.
And I'm going to start the timer on my end. Oh, I want to bring it back just a little bit more. I want you to hear, pretty comfortable in your chair. Do you need to get a drink of water, anything like that?
No, I think I'm okay.
Wonderful. Okay, so what I'm going to have you do is I want you to start the recording on your end.
Yeah, okay.
And I'm going to start the timer on my end. Okay. And then once the recording is starting, just put your phone down. I want you to sit back in your chair. And when you're ready, blink your eyes closed and just take a second to acclimate to having your eyes closed. And I know you said you were a little nervous about doing this. Just give me a level. How are you feeling right now?
Not like too bad. Like,
okay. Great. So Shannon, as though this was in real time, I want you to start to imagine showing up for work at your store and just start to describe that like it's a movie scene.
Okay, so I come in usually, let's say it's like 8:30. No one really comes in. The store doesn't open till 9, but my supervisor usually comes in at like 9:50 or 8:50, and so I'm there early by myself. I unlock the doors, I go in, and immediately I see like the big box of clothes that we got overnight to put on the racks.
What goes through your mind when you see that box of clothes?
It's like there's like a lot of dark colors, and I'm thinking like there's so much dye in these clothes. Like I don't even know where it came from. Like usually it came from some factory somewhere else, and we don't even know the source. And like there's so many things that that just could be wrong with the sweaters that are lying there.
How are you feeling looking at those clothes?
Really uneasy, like kind of just like grossed out, like a little bit disgusted by it, but also just like I don't want them to go on the shelves yet. Like they're not ready. So pretty anxious about that. And so I usually, like, I really have this urge, right, to clean them up. And, you know, my manager always says, just hang them on the rack. Like, just, that's our process. As you come in, you kind of hang the clothes, and then before the store opens, sweep the floors and kind of wipe down the area near the register. And that's like cleaning. But cleaning to me is like, I need to clean the clothes too. And so I really want to do that. Like I have a spray bottle that's near the broom and stuff in the back of the store. And so I can like see that spray bottle, and I'm really thinking, okay, I just need to spray this down, to spray each sweater down before it goes up, and then that'll feel a little bit better.
Because if I didn't spray the clothes, what could happen?
Then, like, as soon as the door opens, we have customers coming in. We have like some like moms come in with their kids, and like they'll be touching the clothes. They'll be like taking stuff off to try it on. They'll put it in their basket. Like the dye just touches like so many other things. Also, like the like handbag or anything that's in the basket. And like even if like people put them back on the rack, they're still. It's just like, I know that dye is toxic. Like there's poisonous things, and especially in these like purpley kind of darker colored dyes, and it's just gonna get everywhere and get on, you know, the people's hands and all over their stuff and follow them home.
Okay, so I want you to go back. It's 8:30 in the morning. I'm standing there looking at the box. I see the spray bottle. I'm feeling uncomfortable and disgusted, and I really want to spray down these clothes. And now I want you to imagine you work hard to not. What does that look like? How do you resist spraying the clothes?
Yeah, it doesn't feel good. Definitely more anxiety. But I try to just kind of like grab the broom instead and do what's on we have like a printed checklist of stuff you're supposed to do if you're opening the store. So just looking at the checklist and doing what's actually on the list instead of what I want to do or what OCD wants me to do. So I start, you know, sweeping the floor, and I can still kind of see the sweaters over there. I know I still have to put them on the rack, but I think maybe if I'm like sweeping first, it'll be easier if I just kind of get started with my list and then come back to that.
Shannon, give me a level right now.
Like a 65.
Okay, good. You're doing a great job. So now I want you to imagine and really try to visualize this. I can't avoid those sweaters forever. So I'm done sweeping, and I've got to go over to that box. I got to pick them up, put them on the rack. Describe what that looks like. What are you doing?
Yeah. So I'm reaching in the box, and I pick up like the hanger, the sweater, like by the hanger that it's on. They're usually on hangers already, which makes it a little better. But I'm touching the hanger, and really lots of thoughts about, this isn't ready, like it's not clean, this is wrong, you should be doing more right now. But I try to put it on the rack anyway. And it's just like lots of feelings about that not being right. Like it's really dirty now. It's next to other sweaters that I know I sprayed down already yesterday, and everything's kind of just getting that toxic dye on it just by being close to each other.
So you're undoing even the cleaning you did yesterday by putting those racks on the sweater. Good. Okay, now what do you imagine happens next?
Yeah. So let's say I'm, putting all the sweaters, once I have the sweaters kind of in their place, we usually check off on our checklist, like once we've done the cleaning for the morning, like there's a box on the list that says, morning cleaning, and then there's a box that says counted the cash in the drawer and stuff like that. And so I'm imagining going over to like our cash register area, checking off the box that says morning cleaning. I have to put my initials by that, and good. I'm checking it off even though everything is not clean and my initials are there on the paper. And
my anxiety is telling me I really should have sprayed down